So in the past semester or year that you've been programming, you have found situations when you find an exception, probably because you misread a file, or maybe because someone gives you a bad input and then crash the computer. So those are called exceptions. I'm going to talk about the distinction between error and exception and syntax errors. But when we deal in an exception, we handle exceptions by using some mechanisms like the try, catch, and finally. And sometimes we want to even throw our exception on purpose. I'll talk about that in a second, and also about inheritance. So let's go ahead and start to discuss why we need exception in the first place. So many programs that we have developed through years, some of them we expect that the program should be perfect, that the user gives us the correct input, gives us the exact value. But real life it might not be the same. So something might happen. Maybe the user gives you the incorrect input. Maybe if you're writing a mobile app and is working GPS, then you lost connections with GPS, your program will misfunction. So I can think in a couple of examples that you play with your phone or with your computer or your software. And at some point, you need to recognize those exceptions and handle them correctly. That's where we're gonna need to introduce this concept of exception handling. We want to make sure when something happens incorrectly, we provide a good message. We also use this to hide information from the user, because not all the information recognizes, or all the information that happens in your program should be available to everyone. And that's something that we consider all the time when we design a software. We don't want that everybody knows what's happening in our code. That is called intellectual property. So help us to hide some information from the rest of the world. And we use this try catch as what we call sandbox. Maybe you have heard about the concept of sandbox, but when you have a situation and you want to test or you want to try something, you basically do it in a sandbox, because worst case scenario, you just fall or crashes into sand and doesn't really hurt product or the elements. So we do that. And sometimes it's okay to crash the program. I'm not saying that it's completely wrong to crash it, but in that case, we want to crash the program in case we want to terminate the program, but depending on the situation that we are living. So we'll talk about those three cases in this lesson, and I'm gonna give you, I like this slide because I'm not so sure how familiar you are with previous versions of Windows, but back in the day when we used to run this Windows 95, right, or Windows NT, or maybe Windows 3.1, there was a situation when something went wrong, and then we got messages like what you're looking right now on the screen. Very cryptic, very not informative, maybe some very technical that only just a few people in the world know what's happening. So these are just example of exceptions that happens in previous versions of Windows. Nowadays, you have better ways to handle these situations because the messages has been improved. They're more informative. They provide you some information. Sometimes they even tell you how to fix the problem. And it depends on where you run your programs or what kind of things you do. That's how the message actually got described or sometimes got fixed. So I like this screen because that is something that I lived when I was younger, I guess, when a couple of messages that, what is that, right? So you called this 800 number customer service in Windows and you wait a couple hours just for they to tell you, you know what, you need to restart your computer. So that was not very encouraging. So based on that situation, we actually wrote more message, more exception handlers. And I like this, this is in your book, but I got this one from a different website. The concept of exception comes directly from inheritance, because remember that Java, one of the nice things about Java is that it uses inheritance. And as you probably know, the grand ancestor of all the objects is called object. So that's where we inherit those 11 methods that you probably remember from CS1. So once we inherit that, we also know that most of the objects are considered to be throttable. Throttable is an interesting concept, and that basically is an interface, right? Because in reality, throttable has two children, exception and error. And this is what you can see in your left-hand side, you have exceptions, right-hand side is when you have the errors. The errors are what's considered to be a machine dependent or something that have critical misfunction or error or an anticipated situation in your hard drive or maybe in your something that doesn't have control. You can see the name of those errors, like virtual machine error, stack overflow error, out of memory error, IO error. So there's a couple of those errors that you may or may not recognize from the previous work that you have done in these courses. But just want to let you know that here is where you need to be careful, because here's when you actually kind of deal with memory, with the stack, with the heap, with the Java virtual machine. And that in the right hand side is where most of the hackers live. They want to have access to that piece of code, that piece of memory or the stack in order to extract information and make vulnerable code. Now in the left hand side, you can see the families of exceptions. That is the entire hierarchies. And you probably recognize a couple of them. Like for example, there's the arithmetic exception, null point exception when we deal with objects, the so-called index out of bounds exception, and we probably know both of them. The array index out of bounds when we're trying to access information from an array, and the string index out of bounds exception. That's where when we're dealing with strings, we're trying to extract an index that is outside of the length or less than 0. You probably remember that part. So these are called exceptions. They're not errors. So exceptions are situations when Java will basically report an exception, letting you know that something funky happened. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be able to basically throw exceptions, try them, catch them, and report them.